So tonight, the world is going to count down to 2024. I don't need to share that with you. You already know. And the shift of years creates a demarcation, a natural point for us to look back, analyze our year, figure out what we did and didn't do, what we did accomplish, what we didn't accomplish, take stock of all of those things, and examine ourselves. And so we've been doing that, the past few years as a church, just to see what God has done, what he has not done in our church. And so we're going to do that today. We're going to take stock of what God has done at Red Rocks Fellowship in 2023. But first, I'm a pastor, so I have to give you a little sermon. It'll be a sermonette. It'll be short. But don't worry, we're going to get there. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, Moses hands down God's commandments, which often makes humanity think that this is how I avoid the wrath of God. If I just do all of his commands, then I'll avoid the wrath of God. But there's a reason and there's a purpose of why God is setting down his commandments once again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. He's setting down his commands for us so that we will see what he's about to do and not forget. That the Israelites would not forget what he's about to do. Because initially he sets down his commandments right in Exodus chapter 20. If you know the Bible real well, you know that that's where you find the 10 Commandments is in Exodus chapter 20. And that's at the beginning of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And then in Deuteronomy 5, what Deuteronomy is Moses recapitulating all of the commands of God for the Israelites as they go across the Jordan, as they're about to go across the Jordan and into the Promised Land. And so this whole recapitulation is to try to help them to understand this is how God wants us to live in this place. And so often we say, well, okay, so God has given us these commands. This is how I avoid the wrath of God. If I obey these commands, at the very least, things won't be catastrophically bad for me. And that's fine as far as it goes. But that sort of mentality is sort of like a football team that goes out and only obeys all of the rules without trying to win. Oh, maybe that's what the Broncos are doing wrong. Right? They don't even try to score. They're just like, we're going to obey all the rules. We're going to make sure we get all of the rules right, but whatever happens, it doesn't really matter. And that's kind of what it is like if we obey all of the laws of God, but don't step into everything else that he has available to us. You see, the Israelites had to step into something. So Moses switches gears after he hands down all of the commandments again, reminds the Israelites of all of the commands of God in chapter 5, and then he switches gears in chapter 6 and says, if you do the things of God, then things will actually go better for you than if you don't. And he says it 3 times. You've been looking at this on the screen in chapter 6. He says, be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you will multiply greatly. And then in verse 18 it says, that it may go well with you and that you may go in and take possession of the good land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And then in verse 24 we have it again. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to fear the Lord our God for our good always. You see, when something is repeated 3 times in that short of a span within scriptures, it's something that we are supposed to pay attention to. The implication is, if you want to win, not just obey, but if you want to win, not just lose, not just not lose, I should say. If you actually want to win and not tie, which is kind of like kissing your sister, which is weird, he says, do these things all the days of your life so that your community might flourish. You see, we don't just obey God simply because, that's how we avoid hell. We obey God because these things that God has set down for us, set aside for us, is for our good. And so, flourishing, if we're successful, we might be able to say, well, that's because God made it so. God made it happen that way because we obeyed, because we did the things of God. Now we flourish. And so therefore we'll be closer to God when we flourish. But here's the rub. Because God sets down all of these commands, and he knows that the reality is that we are more likely to forget God when we flourish. When God brings blessing into our lives, the fact is, we forget him. We're more likely to forget him. And in fact, a closer examination of Deuteronomy 6 shows us that the whole purpose of these commands here is to remind the people, hey, you're about to move into a land that has already been tilled, where wells have already been dug, where cities have already been built, and you're going to move into this land and you're going to benefit from all of that tillage, and you're going to benefit from those wells that have been dug, and you're going to benefit from those cities that have already been built. In fact, you're not going to have to do any of that labor at all. And so therefore, your houses are going to be full. You're going to be successful. And that's when you're most likely to forget God. Look at what Moses says in verse 12. When you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Don't forget God when life is easy for you. That's the shorthand that Moses is giving us. He says this because God is gracious. Moses knows that God is gracious, that God is good to us and has blessed us with fullness and richness. In fact, he's blessed us, even as Americans. We can look at this passage and we can look at it in the same way that the Israelites might have looked at it a few years later after they had taken the promised land. We would look at it the same way and say, God has blessed us with a richness that would be the envy of the entire earth, and is the envy of the entire earth. We have much to thank him for. And since life is easier for us, God knows that it'll be that much easier for us to lose sight of what is important and what got us there. I mean, not that a rich nation would ever dare to forget God, right? But it's actually human nature, well, at least it's the natural state of our sin nature to forget God. The natural state of our sin nature wants to forget God. That is the whole problem with the knowledge that we possess. We think that we can forget God, that we can plan him out of our situations, and that we can work it all on our own. And in fact, we see that taking place all throughout the Old Testament. The Israelites didn't keep his commands, and they forgot him. The first time that we see it is in Judges chapter 3. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. We see it again in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Your fathers cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God. Then we see it again in Hosea chapter 13. And I'm skipping over a whole lot of these occurrences. There's a lot of them. But Hosea chapter 13, verse 6. But when they had grazed, they became full. They were filled, and their heart was lifted up. Therefore they forgot me, says God. This may actually be the reason for God placing struggles in our lives. Because our natural sin nature inclination is to forget him. And he knows that. He knows if he blesses us the way that we want, we'll stop thinking about him. And it's been born throughout history to be true. It's been proven over and over and over throughout history. That's how our sin nature works. So if you're really honest with yourself and you analyze yourself, when times are good, those are the times when you rely most on yourself. And you do forget about God. I'm speaking generally. And so he brings struggle into our existence so that we'll be forced to strain toward the prize that he has waiting for us. James says in chapter 1, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Paul adds to this in Philippians chapter 3, verse 12, "Not that I've already obtained this or am already perfect, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal." You see, Paul is able to make the argument, I was a Jewy Jew, I was the Jewiest of all Jews. Everybody was envying me, and that's all rubbish. It's all a waste of time. And now I'm straining towards a goal that's completely different, a finish line that is completely different than anything I would have set for myself. You see, this is why God sets trials in our lives, so that we'll pursue him, so that we'll recognize him, so that we'll honor him in the midst of all of these successes and victories that he also wants to bless us with. So how do we find joy in trial? How do we strain forward toward a goal? I think the answer is actually back in our initial passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's in remembering what God has done to spur within us the love that will move our lives. If you look at the beginning of the Shema, by the way, the Shema was something that all children in the Jewish culture would memorize first. And so here's what we see. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. In fact, when the Pharisees come to test Jesus, they ask him, what's the most important commandment? And this is what he quotes. The most important thing in our lives, the most important commandment, the most important thing that we can pursue is an intentional pursuit of God. That's what the Shema is telling us. It's an intentional reflection at all times on who he is and what he has done and what he desires of you and me. And so Moses then goes on from that passage. He tells the Israelites, hey, this is what you need to do then. You need to talk about this all the time. Talk about what he's done. Now, this is Parenting Seminar 101. Talk about this with your children at all times, when you sit down and when you get up, when you're out of the house and when you're in the house. Oh, there's not one defined time in which we're supposed to talk about what God has done. No, you're supposed to do it at all times of your life. Won't they get bored with that? No, not if you do it well. Not if it's real for you to talk about the reality of God in your life and what he's done. Talk about his expectations. Talk about his promises and the hope that he brings for your future. Well, that doesn't say that actually in Deuteronomy chapter 6. But it does. We'll get to this in just a little bit. You see, Moses is focused on talking about the commands of God, being diligent about it. But don't separate his instructions from what he has done. Moses says that the purpose of talking about God continually is so that, and we see it in verse 20, when your son asks you in a time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Did you see it in verse 20? Testimonies and statutes. They go hand in hand. Our testimonies go hand in hand with his statutes because these are the background statements of the goodness of God. Wherever we are, the remembrance of what God has done, what he's going to do, go hand in hand with the reminders of what his statutes are for. You see, he didn't give us his statutes just so that we could not lose. He gave us his statutes so that things would go well for us. And so we are to remember God did all of these things for us. He did all these things for us when we were lost and helpless, when we didn't deserve his grace, when we didn't deserve his blessing. That's when he shows up in our lives. That's why he has the right to ask for our obedience. That's why we return to him then, our respect, our praise, our honor, and love to him. Because he first loved us. In fact, that's what John says. We love because he first loved us. And so for us, we need to remember. We need to remember what that love looks like. We need to talk about what God has done in our midst. We need to talk about what he wants us to be. We need to talk about what our future will be when we press into Jesus Christ. Because there is a future. That's why he came, to give us hope and a future. Remembering what Scripture tells us about all of these things, we will watch and point out when we see God show up. Because we'll recognize it. We'll know it when we see it. So, That's what today is all about. That's why we're gathered here on this New Year's Eve, and that's why this is not your typical Sunday sermon. Because our purpose today is different. We're going to remember what God has done today, and we're going to celebrate how good he is in all of the ways that he is blessed. And what we'll see today is that God has been good to Red Rocks Fellowship, and he has provided in numerous ways throughout this year. This is actually our third year of practicing this tradition. We pause, we meditate, we remember, and we celebrate what God has done for us. But it's important, even as I say that we have to keep the order correct. We have to keep the order right. This is what God has done. Because we are not celebrating Red Rocks Fellowship. Sorry. We're not celebrating you. We're not celebrating me. We're celebrating God today and what God has done. So this isn't to toot our horn, pat ourselves on the back. That's the surest way for us to get a cramp, by the way. But this is really intended for us to be an offering of praise to God, to remind ourselves what God has done in Red Rocks Fellowship and through Red Rocks Fellowship, and what we were able to do with God's help and enablement. So all of this is intended to be for God's glory. The fact that we are participating in the act of remembering today is precisely so that we won't think that we accomplished any of this on our own. In a time in history when news cycles get continually more negative and sectarian, I don't think I have to prove that to you. Just turn on the news. In which ideas move ever closer to exchanging God for lies, in which even in our churches, people are more likely to follow ear-tickling leaders than they are to follow the gospel of Jesus Christ. Perhaps we'll see that God is on the move, and when we move with him, we'll have an opportunity to see what he does through us.